Wonderful. Well, hi everyone. My name is Joanna Graham. I'm delighted that you are all joining today to talk and learn a little bit more about what building a personal brand specifically for MBA admissions means. That probably sounds a little bit like some corporate speak, but I promise we'll demystify a lot of that over the next hour. Really excited to chat more with you. So, as I mentioned, feel free to drop in a note in the chat. Let me know where you're dialing in from, where you are in the process. Have you started studying for the GMAT or the GRE, or maybe the executive assessment if you're thinking about round one or round two? Certainly happy to answer as many questions as we can get through this evening. We should have about 10 minutes at the end, hopefully for Q&A. So a little bit about myself. I have been in the higher ed space now for, oh my gosh, over 2 decades. I spent about a decade actually working at the Graduate Management Admission Council. I helped run the GMAT testing program. So even though we're here to talk about admissions, obviously I have a near and dear place in my heart for the GMAT exam, as well as the GRE. So excited to, like I said, excited to connect with you all and talk a little bit more about what's involved in building what we call sort of a personal brand or a profile for admissions. A little bit of additional info on myself. I'm also a former chief marketing and product officer. I've worked in a variety of ed tech companies, of nonprofit companies, certification companies, you name it. And so, what I found over the years is in working with clients and working with folks to apply to business school. One of the things that can be really helpful is you start thinking about how to tell your story. I'm sure wherever you are in the process, you've probably heard about how important it is to sort of nail the story, to make sure that you build a compelling narrative, that you connect all of the dots. Also, while doing so in a very concise way and making sure that you have a story that stands out. Certainly a tall order. And so one of the things that I have found that's helpful is using some of the frameworks that I've used in my corporate career around brand building, around rebranding, to help folks really think about how do you start telling your personal story. For lack of a better term, how do you build that personal brand for MBA admissions? But at the risk of sounding like we're over commoditizing folks, it really is more about thinking about how to tell your own personal story. So that's what we're going to dig into today. Just one note about TTP. So as you probably have figured out, we do more than just admissions. Maybe some of you have signed up for GMAT or GRE prep through TTP. Maybe some of you have found us through a search for admissions consulting. Either way, we offer a little bit of everything. So obviously every different type of test prep under the sun, live classes, self-study, one-on-one tutoring, as well as admissions consulting. There's a team of consultants, in addition to myself, who work with clients on school packages or on an hourly or an a la carte basis to really help support you as you put together the best possible application you can. My contact details are at the end of the presentation. I'm happy to set up a 15-minute consultation with anyone who would like to send over their resume and chat a little bit more about their background and what they're thinking about for business school, and happy to kind of troubleshoot things with you. So let's start. Like I said, I wanted to try to make this as engaging and as interactive as possible. Let's just start by talking about what a brand is. So feel free to drop a note in the chat if you'd like. But when you hear the word brand, what do you think of? And spoiler alert, it's not technically a logo, even though you see a bunch of logos plastered on the slide here. I'll give folks just a minute. Feel free to message one-on-one if you don't want to drop something into the group chat. I know it's always nerve-wracking to be the first person to raise your hand. Fantastic. How you're viewed, identity, any other any other responses. I think those are all certainly really, really great starting points. What represents you? So in many cases, like your reputation, absolutely. The one thing I am not seeing, and this is the one thing that folks oftentimes overlook, is emotion. So at their core, brands really affect how you as a consumer feel about something. So the emotions that you have around something. And so if you think about brands, and so you start thinking maybe about what some of your favorite brands are, I would encourage you to think about that, because we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want to start with, I realize at least on the East Coast where I'm based out of, it is well past coffee hour. But I would love to get a sense of folks, when you see a cup like this, and actually that's probably an assumption that it's coffee. It could be hot chocolate or really, really strong tea. Pick your beverage of choice. What do you think of when you see this white cup with a brown liquid in it? Feel free to drop it in the chat, send me a direct message, whatever you'd like. Cheap. So I love that. That is usually the knee-jerk reaction. The blank cup implies maybe some not so great coffee that's coming out of an office. Maybe it's an office Keurig machine or one of those instant coffee machines, but it's not necessarily something that conveys an idea of being elite or sophisticated or high quality. Generic stomach ache, energy. I like that a lot, Jacob. That's fantastic. I don't know about you. If anyone has young kids, um, I cannot get moving or functioning in the morning without at least 2 cups of this stuff. So, local. I like Hashem. Could be anything. This is fantastic. Oh, Armando, you said Starbucks. So it's interesting. I almost wonder if you got a peek at my slides because let's slap a logo on this cup now. Now, what do folks think about when they see this? If there's a logo on that label. All right, so now we definitely have coffee. What else do we have? What do you guys think of when you see a Starbucks label? It's okay if we have like Blue Bottle folks or if we have Dunkin' folks, you can feel free to pick whichever corporate logo you'd like. But what changes when you see a logo on that coffee cup? There we go. Yep. Yep, we see some dollar signs, pricey, reliable. You know what you're paying for. There's something that you associate with that. Some type of promise quality, a little less unique, maybe trendy. Again, maybe if it's, maybe it's a blue bottle, like an artisanal logo, then there's maybe it's a little bit more trendy these days. Delicious food and beverages. Yes, I'm a big fan of a feta wrap, so I'm right there with you. Um, you guys are getting the point of the exercise. As soon as you put a logo on it, it conjures up some type of emotional response. And that at its core is what really good brands do. And so the idea here is that, it's not to say that Starbucks is better than Dunkin' or Blue Bottle is better than Starbucks or fill in the blank. Or maybe, maybe I don't want to ignore our friends to the north. Maybe you're a Tim Hortons fan. And you love that combination of, of a glazed donut and your Tim Hortons coffee. It doesn't really matter what the logo is. It's more about this idea that as soon as you put a brand or associate a brand with something, an experience, a product, it conjures up some type of emotional response. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. At the end of the day, good brands are able to affect and influence the way people think and feel about products, or services, or even organizations. And so if you take a look at this slide, and I realize given everything that is happening in this country right now, some of these logos might not always conjure up the same the same emotions that they did previously. But bear with me for the sake of the example. When you look at some of these organizations, some of these companies, some of these brands, this is typically the type of emotional response they're going for when they think about how they're building that brand, how they're marketing themselves, how they're positioning. All of this influences everything that these companies do, from the products and services that they choose to produce and sell, to the way that they talk about them, to the way that they think about themselves in a public space. And all of these companies are really well aware of the fact that not everybody's going to love them. And in some cases, they're okay with that. And maybe I might even invite that because it creates buzz. It gets them to be a part of the conversation. And so as you start thinking about maybe your favorite brands, I would encourage you to maybe think a little bit about what are some of the brands that you identify with? What are some of the brands that you are just naturally attracted to? And what about them is attracted to you? What type of emotion do you have when you see that brand or when you're engaging with a product or a service from that particular company? And why does it keep helping you kind of come back as potentially a repeat customer? Oops, we are going the wrong way. My mouse is getting a little crazy. Um, the reason that this is important, and I promise we're actually going to talk about business school. This is just me geeking out because, I'm a former CMO. I love this kind of stuff. I love branding and storytelling. The reason that this is important, though, is because as consumers, and I'm sure every single one of you can identify with this, we are bombarded with content across channels all the time. Whether it's Instagram or TikTok or whether it's just the web in general. I mean, we are bombarded with content 24/7. The fact is, the matter is, TikTok has over 1 billion users. There are over 4 billion images that are uploaded daily, and shared daily. If you think about the attention span that we have when it comes to these things, it's relatively short. And so if you are a brand trying to make an impact, with not only your existing customers, but trying to attract new customers, you have to really think about how can you make that emotional connection. If you think about websites, there are over 1.5 billion websites on the internet, but only a small fraction of them are actually active. The example that I always like to use with folks, and when I ran a marketing shop years ago, I always loved the Super Bowl, and this was pre Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce days, but I always loved the Super Bowl because as a marketer, the Super Bowl ads were just such a fascinating case study in messaging and branding. I would always ask my team the next morning, what were your top two or three favorite ads? And tell me about what happened in the ad. And 99% of the time, they could tell me what happened in the ad. But then when I would ask them, what were they actually trying to sell you? It was probably about 50-50 in terms of products or brands that people actually remembered from, or products or services that people actually remembered from those commercials. And that's a really powerful exercise if you think about it. Because now, if we start thinking about business school, you are going to be competing and you apply to business school with tens of thousands of other highly qualified individuals. And chances are they probably come from industries that are similar to or identical to the ones that you are working in. And so one of the big questions here is how do you create a story? How do you create a brand, a profile that stands out amongst all of that noise? How do you become the newest trend, like cats and sliced bread that lasts more than a hot second? I think I heard today on the news somewhere that sardine summer is going to be the big trendy thing for the summer. So how do you stand out, more so than a can of sardines in sardine summer? So that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about. So let's now shift and start talking about people. So we've been talking about products and services. So let's take a look at some of the folks up on this slide. And I would ask you to think a little bit about what do these folks have in common? And if you don't recognize everyone up here, that's perfectly fine. We will definitely we'll definitely chat a little bit more in just a moment. But again, feel free to drop notes in the chat if there are things that you associate with some of the folks here. And then we'll move on in just a moment. Yep, these are folks who are known internationally. They're all very recognizable, probably for very, very different reasons. Um, I think one of the most important things when you look at these folks is, yep, they're all very influential. They're all leaders in various industries. Is we start thinking more about what they represent. They all have very, very strong brands. And again, when you think about the word brand, there are emotional responses that are elicited. Whether you're someone like Zelensky, who has obviously been in the news more recently for his leadership and the work and his work fighting the war in the Ukraine, but a lot of folks don't realize, who probably didn't realize this before Ukraine was in the news on a daily basis, that he was an actor and a comedian before that. And so he built a whole public persona, profile, a personal brand that was rooted in entertainment. Sarah Blakely is known as the founder of Spanx. But she has consistently reinvented herself. She has consistently churned out new products. Her latest product on the market, we'll see how it does, but they're women's sneakers with heels on them. So it's a combination, it's a hybrid of trying to fuse comfort and functionality with style. This is coming on the heels of the Spanx empire that she built. I think a lot of folks, I think Rihanna actually and Jose Andres are probably two of the best examples on here because you think about most, I think most folks, I'll date myself a little bit from my generation, um, think of Rihanna and they think of music first. But I talk to a lot of folks from, either Gen Z or Gen Alpha, and they know Rihanna because of her beauty brands. That's the first thing that comes to mind before her music. And the same thing with Jose Andreas. I think most folks, know that he is an incredible humanitarian, and is around the globe. Whenever something bad happens, there he is serving hot meals. But 20 years ago, he was running restaurants in DC. And while he still does have restaurants all over the country, that was what he was known for first. Um, and then finally, and I don't want to leave out Jacinda Ardern either. She's actually, I think she just launched a global book tour as well. But she really changed sort of the definition of women in politics and leadership when she was Prime Minister of New Zealand and what it meant to be a working mom. But there were strong brands that were associated again with all of these leaders. Doing so with kindness, doing things the right way because that was just the way that we should be doing things. Building a brand and then pivoting and starting to build a completely different career or put in completely another phase of their career in a completely different industry. All of these folks have very, very specific, very intentional, curated brands that they have built around themselves. So now, as we start coming down from 35,000 feet, because I'm sure you're all looking at this going, okay, that's great, but how does Rihanna's brand help me talk about myself if I want to apply to HBS this fall? So let's talk a little bit about what it means to now build a personal brand. I do this exercise with every client, whether they are a pre-MBA, whether they are an executive, if I'm doing executive coaching, or whether they're a high school student, if I'm doing pre-college coaching. At the end of the day, building brands and talking about yourself can really be rooted in three things. And this is a great starting point I would encourage all of you to think about. I call this the EPA exercise, expertise, purpose, and authenticity. So number one, expertise. This is really basic. This is the stuff that you are good at. But when you start thinking about yourself as an individual, as a brand, it's important to recognize that you are so much more than just a skill, more than a technical skill, more than a talent. But this is a great way to start thinking about. This is sort of the foundational layer that you need to think about. So expertise, what are the things that you are good at? Are you great at coding? Are you great at pivot tables? Can you read a P&L statement faster than anybody else on your team and yeah, and come up with and analyze it? Um, are you an incredible humanitarian? Do you really believe in animal rights? And then do you spend your weekends, volunteering at animal shelters? Think about the things that you are very, very good at. Um, for me, it took me a long time to realize that I was actually really good at storytelling. I started off my career in operations, building and product development. So building products and figuring out how to manage products. And it took me 10 years to figure out that I'm actually a much better storyteller than I am a product builder and pivoted into marketing and reinvented myself. Having those two experiences, having those two strengths, that is a big part of my own personal brand when I'm out interviewing for jobs or when I'm looking at what projects to take on. Having a strong product foundation and then being able to be a marketer, that's a really powerful combination, and that's a big part of my own personal and professional brand. So I would encourage you to start thinking about expertise. That's the easy stuff. The next one's a little bit tougher. So this idea of purpose. You can call it drive, you can call it mission, you can call it whatever you'd like. But at the end of the day, purpose is what gets you out of bed in the morning. And maybe more specifically, what gets you out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday? Because chances are, for most folks, the things that you're really good at, the expertise, the pivot tables, P&L statements, consulting, building business plans, I don't know, building slide decks in Canva, who knows? Those are not going to get you out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, unless you maybe work in a handful of industries and are working longer hours than the typical 9 to 5 Monday through Friday gym. But that being said, purpose really is at your core. What are the things that move you to want to do something? And so as you start thinking about the things that are meaningful to you, I always encourage folks to think about this separate from expertise first. Really spend some time thinking about, what does drive me? Why did I choose to major in what I did when I was in college? Have I used that since then? If I've pivoted, what spurred that decision point or what influenced that decision? um, is you start thinking about your why for business school. This is so important because this is really going to be what starts to inform the why do you want an MBA? Why do you want to go to our school? These questions that are so important, both for the essays, for the interview, for every piece of the process. This ultimately starts with your own sense of purpose. What drives you? What resonates? So I would encourage you to think long and hard about this. And once you've done so separate from your areas of expertise, I would encourage you then to take a look at the two and spend some time thinking about where some of the natural alignment is, where some of that natural overlap is. And then also looking at the deltas, because that can sometimes be just as telling, if not more, than the former. And then lastly, we have authenticity. And I'll be honest, I don't love the word authenticity as much these days. I feel like it has been a little bit overused, which is very ironic given the definition. But at its core, authenticity is what makes you uniquely you. Um, there's a great exercise that I send all of my clients home with during this process, during this initial process. And I ask them to go and talk to 5 different people in their life. The only rule here is that they have to be people who come from different concentric circles in your life. So, maybe a parent or a sibling, maybe a best friend, maybe a colleague, maybe a mentor. The idea here is that at our core, we tend to show up as slightly different versions of ourselves depending on who we're with. And that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that we're being disingenuous by any means, or we're not being our authentic selves in front of folks. But what it really means is that, we tailor the way that we act, the way that we respond based on the circle that we're in, around the company that we're keeping in that particular moment. Um, it's a good thing because it does provide this sense of sort of cultural, environmental awareness and sensitivity. Um, I would hope that you don't act the same way around your frat brothers that you would do around your mentor work. Um, but it also allows us to really start thinking about what are the things at our core that are consistent. And so the exercise basically is go to five different folks, ask them to come up with three words to describe you and make a list. And then start looking at where some of the overlap is and where some of those deltas are. And all of that is going to be very telling as we start thinking about then how does this overlay with this idea of purpose, with this idea of expertise? These are all going to be some of those foundational building blocks that you can use to start thinking about what is so unique about you as you think about how to start telling that story. So you stand out from all of the other management consultants. You stand out from all of the other engineers out there who are applying to school. And more importantly, you can start telling your own story to admissions officers, who are reading those applications and really kind of connect the dots in terms of why you want the MBA, what you're going to do with it, and start sketching out what that future looks like for you. So let's start talking about sort of what your own personal brand is. One of the things that I think is important to really think about here is, I break it down into sort of five steps here. The spoiler alert here is that, building a personal brand is much more than just your LinkedIn headline. Um, we'll start with purpose. And so one of the things, and this is a little bit of a riff on sort of the EPA purpose that we just talked about, but it is really important to think about what is the purpose? What is the goal of your MBA? So number one, start by thinking about how do you define your end goal? An end goal can be defined in a couple of different ways. Maybe end goal is where you want to be 15, 20 years from now. Maybe end goal is 10 years, 5 years. Maybe it has multiple steps. Um, the idea here, though, is to start sketching out what those different phases look like. And if you end up with a list of goals that are sort of micro goals that roll into larger ones, then you're doing the exercise correctly. So the idea here is to really think through what do the next couple of phases of your life look like? And again, if you're thinking about the MBA, or I should also maybe mention a specialized master's or whatever graduate degree you're looking at, um, start thinking now about what role does that degree play in this journey? What are you not going to be able to do if you do not go to business school? And that will start helping you articulate and really ideate about why you need the MBA, because that obviously is the million-dollar question. Next up, competition. So competition, I mean, there's obviously a lot of competition there. Um, the first thing to think about with competition is, who are you competing against? And I know everyone starts by saying, well, I'm competing against everyone else who's applying to HBS. I mean, competing against every other management consultant who's applying to Stanford. Um, those are the easy answers. It's important to really start thinking about what those different pools look like. So maybe it is management consultants. Maybe it is individuals who all graduated from a particular university. Maybe it is people who want to pivot and move into entrepreneurship. It is important to really think about what your competitive set is going to look like when you apply to business school. And then the more important step, which I sometimes think that people often overlook, is starting to think about not only like what are they good at, what's your competition good at, but what are you better than everyone else at? And this is where that EPA exercise can come in handy. Because let's say you're an engineer, but you also have a very artistic and creative side. What are some of the things that you do? Maybe you dabble in art, maybe you volunteer, I don't know, and teach music lessons. Who knows? But maybe there is a part of your life that is very, very different from engineering, though, that really helps create some balance and that can help set you apart as you start thinking about what are some of those other skill sets? What are those, what we call differentiators that will help give you a little bit of a competitive edge over your peers, over those other folks you're competing with, for some of those spots. That's going to be a big part of the conversation around competition. So don't just think about the fact that you're competing against all the other consultants or all the other finance folks. Think about really what are your differentiators? What makes you better than in that competitive pool? Next, think about your audience. So who are you really trying to convince or persuade? Oh, could I just ask folks to go on mute, actually, if you're not? Thank you very much. When you think about your audience, again, I think most folks immediately jump to, well, it's the person reading your application. It's the admissions officer or the admissions director at Wharton or at MIT Sloan. Yes, you are absolutely trying to convince and persuade them. But you are also thinking about the person who could potentially be interviewing you. So think about current students, think about alumni. Think about all the other touch points that you're going to have as you learn about the school. And so it's important, you never know when you're going to be with someone who might have some type of influence, who might be able to help you think through sort of what the experience might be like. And so it's always important, I always encourage folks, is they're going to these events, is you're going to online info sessions, or maybe it's in-person events even. Um, think of anyone with whom you're engaging as someone that you're trying to persuade. Give me one second. I'm going to see if I can mute folks because if we can't, because we got a little bit of noise. Give me just one second. Okay. Zoom is not letting me do that. If I could maybe just put out one more request to mute your microphones if you are not already, that would really be fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Um, so as I was saying, your audience is again, it's really anyone with a potential touch point with the university. It's important to really ask and think about what is important to them and to the organization, to the school at large. And so what I would encourage you to think about here too is, if you think about your undergraduate institution that you went to, in many ways, what if you were asked to interview someone applying, a high school senior applying to your school? What are some of the things that you might look for? What are some of the things that might be deterrents? What are the things that you valued about your undergrad experience that you would really want someone to convince you that they're leaning into those things in order to go to school there? So again, I encourage folks because I think undergrad institutions are often a great frame of reference when you're thinking about business school. Because at the end of the day, if you loved your undergrad experience and you loved everything about it, then you probably want to be a little bit of a gatekeeper. You want to make sure that the folks who are continuing to have these great experiences at universities reflect the values and the mission of that institution. And so it's the exact same thought with business school. And so I encourage you to think about, what is important to them. Start by going to, and actually start by going to the university's website. Take a look at their mission statement. Take a look at the things that they value and the things that they come out and actually say are important to them. And then think about how your own experiences, your professional experience, your extracurricular experiences align with those values. And that's going to certainly be part of your compass and your roadmap as you think about how to tell that story. All right, so as we think about what the next part, sort of your mission statement, or what you might call your elevator pitch, call it whatever you'd like. Um, this is really where you want to think about how do you sum up your personal brand? How do you sum up who you are as a person and what you want to do? Um, Practice this. Practice writing it out, practice delivering it to friends and family, ask for feedback. When you think about it, these are the two or three things that you would want someone to remember about you if you had a few minutes with them. Think about what is most important to you as a person, as a future applicant, and really think about what is important to you as you think about the future career that you're trying to build as well. And so we'll talk a little bit more about sort of what exercises you can do and and some starter questions to think about this in just a moment or two. But mission statement is going to be really important. I really do encourage folks to try to over-index on the amount of time you're spending here. And then lastly, what we call sort of our brand voice. And so this is a great thing to reflect on as well, because I think it's important to think about how do you want to come across? How do you want people to perceive you? And there's a delicate balance here, obviously, between this idea of being your authentic self, but also making sure that what you're saying lands well, what you're saying resonates with the person reading your application, the person interviewing you. And so I encourage you to spend a lot of time, as you go through again, like the EPA exercise is a great place to really think about the things that are important to you and how they align with the schools you're applying to. But above all, I always encourage folks, make sure that you are not losing your unique voice in an effort to be something or someone that you think a school is looking for. The reality the reality is, and I've read applications at a handful of schools in the last 20 years. The folks reading applications have been doing this a really, really long time. Um, they're really good at sniffing out authenticity, or lack thereof. And so if you present yourself as something that you're not, chances are the school will probably figure it out. And so, don't do yourself a disservice by trying to reinvent yourself for the purpose of your application. All right, so let's talk for just a minute or two about sort of what this personal brand statement, what this mission statement might look like, or how you may be able to get started. I think that the image at the bottom here is something that a lot of folks struggle with. It's just this idea of how do I make sense out of a lot of the noise and the chaos. A couple of starter questions for you to think about. Um, and you can also feel free to take these to friends and colleagues as well to help you get started if you're getting stuck. But how would someone describe you as a team member, or as a leader? And I would think about this in the context of your current job, but I would also think about this through the context or through the lens of academia. So maybe think about your undergrad experience, and group projects and things that you worked on as a student. Um, the next one is, sort of what is your superpower? So this is just a really nice fancy way of saying, what are your strengths? What are your areas of expertise? But I would try to think about it maybe through a lens, again, if you're thinking about business school and you're thinking about cohorts, um, what is the strength that you bring to the table? One of my favorite questions when I'm interviewing folks is asking them, hey, tell me what two of your superpowers are. And again, superpowers, I would love to be able to leap tall buildings. But at the end of the day, I just want to know in your opinion, what are one or two things that you're bringing to this university that are going to make other people better, that are going to make the university and the community better? Because in your own words, that is incredibly powerful. Because if you're able to articulate that well, that tells me that that is how you are going to show up. Um, it's interesting when I've sat on admissions committees, one of the questions that comes up time and time again is at the end when folks are kind of in that war room making decisions is it's not, it's not do we think that they're the smartest? Do we think they're going to be in the top 5%? Do we think anything overly technical? It is, would I want to be this person's roommate, or would I want to be their cohort mate? Do they feel like someone who's going to pull their own weight, or who's going to pull their weight, who's going to lift other people up? Um, I think in many cases, if anyone's thinking about applying to Wharton, I'm sure you probably have seen the team-based discussion, which is Wharton's flavor of the MBA interview. And one of the things that I really love about the team-based discussion is the fact that it gives folks an opportunity to see how you engage with others. And really, and while it is kind of a microcosm, of the business school experience, it is such a telling experience to see how people engage with one another, especially when they're given a problem or a scenario to work through or to solve. I think it's really hard for folks to not fall into their natural tendencies. And so again, this is a great way to think about, what are some of the things that I just default to doing. In that same vein or a similar one, what do you celebrate about yourself? So what are you really proud of when you think about things that you've done, things that you've accomplished, maybe things that you've overcome? And then lastly, sort of this question that I just alluded to, this idea of, would you want to be my cohort mate, or would you want to be my roommate? Um, so much about business school, if you talk to folks, it really does come down to the community, the network that you're building. And for many of you, I would suspect that you're probably thinking about business school as a way to broaden your professional network, whether you're looking to pivot into a new industry, or maybe if you have entrepreneurial aspirations, maybe you're looking for a co-founder, or other partners. But when you really think about this, the at its core, are you someone that people are going to be, are you someone people will naturally gravitate towards, to work on projects? And how are you going to show up? And who are the people that you want to show up for you? So all of these, I think, are great starter questions to sort of start mulling over as you think about what that personal brand statement looks like. Certainly, this is going to be something that you can use as you develop an elevator pitch, as you start thinking about how you present yourself, at events, in interviews, in meetings, etc. But probably more importantly, this is going to be a great foundation as you start thinking about how to start talking about yourself in your essays. Is for some of you maybe who are looking at HBS, HBS changed their essays recently, a few years ago. And now there are three much shorter response, sort of open questions that folks are asked to respond to. You have to be very, very deliberate and how you answer those questions. You need to be very specific, obviously, in terms of what you choose to highlight about yourself, about your experiences, about your hopes, your dreams in those essay questions. It's very, very different than the much larger, longer form essays that many schools have. And so, going through this exercises, I think, is a great way to start sort of distilling out what are the things that are really important to you, and also will help you to prioritize how you want to talk about some of these things as well. So let's talk for just a minute here about sort of just holistic admissions in general and the importance of fit. So depending on where you are in the process, there's a whole list of things here that probably isn't a surprise to any of you. These are all things that admissions officers in schools are looking for in the application. But what you may not know or what may be glossed over sometimes is this idea that admissions really is a very holistic process. And schools use this term very deliberately. What it really means is it's just a fancy way of saying that there isn't a certain number of points that are assigned or a certain weight or value that's assigned to each individual component of your application. Schools really look at a profile at an individual very holistically, and they recognize that you are the sum of all of your experiences, all of your parts. And so we'll start with professional experience. So as and I'm sure as you're doing your school research, you've seen that, many schools, most schools, tout that, students have anywhere from 3 to 7 years of work experience. That's what they're looking for. There's a reason for that. It means you've been in the workforce long enough, that you've probably had some successes. There are probably some things that you would do a little bit differently. You've had an opportunity to grow, to be promoted, to maybe change jobs once or twice. It really gives schools an idea of the type of experiences that you have aggregated since coming out of the undergrad experience. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to everything, and I'm sure you'll hear about folks who were admitted to programs either with less experience or with more experience. But the vast majority will have experience somewhere in that 3 to 7 year range. And it's important as you're starting to think about your professional experience to really think about what are the stories? So again, this is a great exercise that you can start working on now, while it's still very early, maybe while you're waiting for schools to release those prompts. Um, as you think about some of those areas of expertise, some of those superpowers we just talked about, go through your resume and think about examples, think about stories, very specific, like tactical examples that demonstrate these things, and start writing them down. Wherever you can add some quantifiable metrics, results you were able to drive, money you were able to save, number of deals you closed, you name it. Include that level of detail because those numbers are going to be incredibly important. This is also maybe a great hint that you may want to take a look at your resume because I think that is oftentimes one of the most overlooked pieces of the application. Folks just assume if your resume was good enough to get you a job, it's good enough for business school. And the reality is that the resume works a little differently for you in the business school process. And so it is important to update your resume so that it's appropriate for MBA for an MBA program as opposed to sending it to a corporate recruiter. Academics. So schools are going to take a look at where you went to school and how you did. They'll want to see, did you take challenging courses? It's not to say that one course of study is better or more important than another, but they are going to take a look and see, if you pursued a very, very technical or complicated course of study or major and did particularly well, that's going to mean something. They're going to look at that undergrad GPA, or if you have another advanced degree, if you have a master's, they're going to look at the most recent GPA very, very closely. Again, everything counts. Everything is going to be something that schools look at, but it is really important to think about, especially if you have more recent degrees, um, what your most recent performance in the classroom looked like. For those of you who might be sitting here going, oh, maybe I went out a little bit too much my freshman and sophomore year of college. Maybe I didn't prioritize studying as much as I should have. There are things you can do to compensate and to mitigate against a lower than ideal undergraduate GPA. I always encourage folks, depending on the runway that you have, if you're a year or two out, there's certainly things you can do to go back, maybe do some additional coursework, especially if quant maybe was a potential area of weakness for you as an undergrad. It is really important to be able to demonstrate to schools that you have the quantitative chops and ability to do well in a rigorous program. So maybe it's a matter of going back to school to a local university and taking a couple semesters to be able to show a school that you can be successful in the classroom. If you're on a little bit of a tighter time frame, if you're talking about, applying this fall, this is a great place where a high test score can help compensate for some of this as well a little bit. Again, it's not a one-for-one swap. This is the whole idea of holistic admissions. It's not to say that there's a certain number of points you get for having a GMAT score in the 99th percentile, although that would be certainly very nice for anyone. Um, but for example, if you did major in something that was quant related as an undergrad and your GPA is not great, but you knock the GMAT or the GRE out of the park and you do a really great job on the quantitative section in particular, that will give a school more confidence that you are going to have the skills in order to be successful in that program. The last thing I'll just say here about that is too that the most recent data point I think is going to be the most valuable and the most helpful. And so as you think about your timeline, as you think about some of these things, I would encourage you to build that into your timeline and your thinking as well. So test scores, we kind of touched on a little bit. That's fairly straightforward. Extracurricular activities and community service. If you thought that this was just something you needed to focus on or think about in high school, the reality is this is something that schools do look at and really do analyze very closely in the application process. And the reason for that is that just like an undergrad institution, there are going to be clubs, there are going to be activities. There are all sorts of things that business schools offer to help enhance the student experience, to help build community. And they want to see what type of contributor you're going to be. So, what types of things are you involved with? How do you choose to spend your time when you are not at work? Because when you are enrolled in a full-time MBA program, classes become your full-time job, and then everything you do outside of class, that is that is very that's those are very intentional choices because you're choosing to spend your time doing something that isn't always necessarily directly related to your core responsibility, and that obviously that being a student. And so it's important to be able to show schools that there are things that you do care about. Again, this aligns very closely with the P part of EPA, the purpose. So really thinking about, what are those things that drive you? What are the things that you are truly passionate about? Um, one of the questions that I receive often is it too late if I'm applying round one to start doing things over the summer? It's never too late, but it obviously it's going to be very obvious to a school if you started doing a significant amount of volunteer work in June or July, right before an early September deadline. I would encourage you, if you are trying to add some new activities, to be really intentional about them. And I'll give you a couple of examples. For folks, for example, maybe who don't have a strong quantitative background, but maybe you decide to take a finance or accounting class to be able to show that you have those quantitative skills if you were a liberal arts major in college and so don't have a lot of quant experience on your transcript. Is there a way that you could work with a local like nonprofit or a startup to maybe help them do some of their bookkeeping, to do some work on the finance side as a volunteer? But then it's a win-win because it also is a way to show that you do have those quantitative skills. So I encourage you to be really intentional, really think about what you can do to really sort of align and start connecting the dots for the admissions folks as you think about your story here. Obviously, alignment with a school's mission and values. We talked a little bit about that, and we'll take a look at two schools' sort of mission statements in just a minute too, so you can see it a little bit more clearly even. Brand, everything we've been talking about here, all this stuff, a very distinct point of view and perspective. This comes through in essays, it comes through in interviews. The other thing that I should mention that is not listed on here are those letters of recommendation. Don't gloss over those either. It's a key asset in the process. And if you can leverage your letter writers to include specific stories, specific examples that maybe you would love to include in the application, but haven't been able to figure out how to put them into an essay, that's a great place for some of those things to show up as well too. Soft skills. This is the wonderful bucket of skills that can't be quantified, but everyone talks about how important they are. So, how do you show leadership? How do you show that you have grit, that you're resilient, that you're intellectually curious? You can show these things through your activities, through your extracurriculars. This is a great place within letters of rec to have these things highlighted. One of the things I recommend to folks as you're thinking about letters of rec is to go through and see what are the questions on a school's letter of recommendation, and then call out specifically what are the soft skills that they're asking someone to rate you on, and then work backwards. Start coming up with examples that highlight those things and share those things with your letter writers. These are going to be great. These will be great examples that they can get super specific in their letter of rec and validate even further a lot of the wonderful things that you'll be saying in your essay as well. And then finally, the interview. So the interview is obviously going to be incredibly important. We actually have a whole separate webinar, so I'm not going to on the art of interviewing and mock interviews, so I won't necessarily go into a ton of detail here. But obviously, it's going to be consistent with the brand and the story that you're building. I wanted to offer just a quick snapshot of two schools with very, very different and distinct mission statements. And I think it's important, as you are thinking, both of these schools have fantastic business schools. They're obviously very, very different. But I think it's interesting, when you look at a school like Georgetown that leads in their mission statement with this idea that, we're looking to support discourse. There's a commitment to justice. Diverse community devoted to social justice, restless inquiry. There's a big focus on community. There's a big focus on community engagement. And they're really looking for students who are looking to be change makers. You don't see anything in here compared to the mirror sort of Columbia statement here, where they talk about, in the first sentence they come out, most important center of research, distinguished learning environment. And then you see research, knowledge, learning in multiple places in here. Again, it's not to say that Georgetown doesn't value research or learning or academics. Oops, I got a little ahead of myself. Sorry, my mouse is going crazy again. But it's just to say that there are different things that Georgetown's going to value compared to a school like Columbia. And every business school is going to be like this. And so it's really important to get a sense of, in your research, of what these schools value, what they are looking for in applicants, in their students. And then think about how do your own experiences and areas of expertise align with the things that they are looking for. All right, last slide, and then we will open it up for Q&A. A couple of do's and don'ts depending on where you are in the process. I encourage folks at this point on the stage, if you're thinking about round one or round two, fantastic. Start by inventorying all of your skills and experiences. So what I was talking about earlier, with professional experience, go through and start building out a very robust list of experiences, results you've been able to drive, um, impacts, stories, all of those things. And then take a look at maybe where some of the gaps and the weaknesses might be in your application, in your profile, and start building a plan to figure out how to mitigate against those. Maybe it raises the profile or the importance of testing for you. Maybe it means that that you'll have very specific asks of the folks writing your letters of rec. But be really brutally honest with yourself and think about what are the things that a school could ding me on. Start researching schools now. So a handful of schools have already released deadlines and essays, but many have not. And so this is a great time to start signing up for every single listserv you possibly can, start attending online sessions, doing all of that work now, that initial research and groundwork, to engage with schools to learn about how you're going to align best with, or how you'll align with what they have to offer is going to be important. And then think about an engagement strategy. Is it feasible for you to hop on a plane and go visit a campus? Or, maybe it's not realistic and online visits, online webinars, info sessions are the way to go. But build a strategy and be really deliberate about setting goals for yourself around, here are the 3 things I'm going to do this week. These are, this is basically my timeline for engaging with a particular school or the deadline that I'm going to give myself to learn things about the school. Build a timeline for yourself. So think about what can you reasonably accomplish over the summer. If you're thinking about round one versus round two, for some schools, it doesn't matter. So for HBS, they take the same number of folks in round one versus round two. Um, don't necessarily entertain the idea of round 3 or 4, but really think about what schools do I want to commit to and can I reasonably commit to for round one? What schools might I have to push to round 2 potentially? Start engaging with your network. So this is the time now to start asking folks, do you know someone who went to Wharton? Do you know someone who went to Sloan? Do you know someone who went to Anderson? Would you mind doing a soft intro? And could I schedule a 20 minute, virtual coffee chat with them? Tap into your network to start learning about these programs. And then finally, start working on a budget. Is you probably have seen, business school is not the cheapest endeavor. nor is a lot of the prep that goes into it. And so start by building a budget, figure out what you can afford, especially if it's going to mean relocating, and really just think about what are the implications of all that. A couple of the don'ts, hopefully most of these are pretty straightforward and obvious, but every year I have folks who, where these become issues, and so I like to call them out. Is you're thinking about programs, pick programs based on fit, not just because it's convenient, just because maybe it's in a market that's a little bit where the cost of living is a little bit cheaper. It doesn't mean it's a great reason to skimp pennies there necessarily and pick the program for that sole reason. For letters of rec, this is the time when you also want to start thinking about letters of recommendation. Who are you going to ask? If you're not able to ask a supervisor at your current job, who else might you ask instead? It really is important to start thinking about this and strategizing about this early instead of waiting until the last minute, especially because what you'll find is that not every school asks for the same things in their letter of rec or the same format. And so you may have folks who end up having to write a couple different versions or derivatives of those letters. It's really, really helpful to ask them early. As I mentioned before, don't pick up five brand new extracurriculars. And more importantly, don't assume that your dream school and perfect fit is going to be the same as others. I think that, it's easy to get caught up in rankings. It's easy to get caught up in brand names. Really try to find a program that's going to help you best achieve your future long-term goals. And then finally, be careful about just parallel tracking too many things at the same time. You certainly can, because there are only so many hours a day you can study for the GMAT before your eyes want to fall out of your head. And so certainly there are things you can do to parallel track activities together. But definitely think about what is reasonable for you, because you're obviously juggling quite a bit. All right, I think we've got a couple minutes left. I'm going to open up the chat, or if folks want to come off of mute and ask questions, please feel free to do so. My email address is at the bottom. If you'd like to set up a consultation, please feel free to reach out. As I mentioned, TTP offers 15-minute consultations. Happy to chat with you if you send over a copy of your resume and answer any questions you might have about the process. But I'll pause there and just say thank you so much for joining today. It was a pleasure to engage with you all, and hopefully this gave folks some new insights and some ways to think about how to tell your story in your applications. Great question here about how deep to go. Is there such a thing as trauma dumping? There are. I think it's a great question. I always tell folks if you're the goal of sharing something should never be shock and awe. And you never want to think that you're being admitted to business school because someone feels maybe sorry for you or based on the things you've had to go through. And frankly, schools aren't going to say yes because of that either. So it's always really important as you think about your past experiences. Um, Use them if they're going to be a vehicle to be able to talk about something positive, something constructive, particularly growth. And then use sort of the 20-80 ratio to think about how you talk about them. So 20% in the past, 80% forward looking. And so again, don't create shock and awe and go too deep just for the sake of sort of dumping your life story on someone. But you can absolutely use it as a vehicle to talk about how you've been inspired to maybe pursue some of the activities that you have, or maybe if it inspires, maybe if it's going to inspire some of your future plans, that certainly is a way. That certainly is a way for you to leverage that in your application as well. Great question. See, we have a question here for letter. Would it help to work with lawyers on a draft? So this is really sensitive. Um, you cannot write your letters of rec. And you can certainly give them guidance. Every single client I work with, we work on a very, very detailed 1 to 2 page document that they give to all their letter writers. It is certainly strategic, but you should not be sitting down with your letter writer, and you should not be drafting a copy of your letter. This happens every year where someone will say, well, my letter writer's too busy and told me just to draft something. You should not be drafting or wordsmithing these letters. Ideally, most folks they're never even seeing these. But I do know that oftentimes folks will send draft copies back and forth. If your letter writers send you a draft to take a look at, you can certainly take a look at private feedback. A lot of times folks will send them to me and I'll provide feedback as well. But you should not be collaborating with them on these letters though. Oh, this is a great question about family businesses. This happens with a lot of clients I work with. So if you have a family business, you can certainly. It might not be the easiest thing in the world to ask like mom or dad maybe to write your letter of rec. I always encourage folks if you're working in a family business, if you have a vendor or maybe if you have a client who you've gotten to know really well who could provide a letter of recommendation, that would be a great person or a great individual to provide that perspective. And this two pager that I mentioned, so when I work with folks, we build a pretty detailed matrix that maps experiences and soft skills, and we provide weights, and we go through a whole process to basically help prioritize what are the things we want letter writers to focus on. And then we turn that into a really lovely, bright, shiny, pretty two-page document, Word document or Google Doc that's sent to letter writers that helps give them a roadmap for those letters of rec. It's something I would definitely encourage you spending some time thinking about how to provide some guidance, but not scripting it. So, and there's a question here about when should taking the GMAT and getting a high score on it be prioritized. In an ideal world, if you are starting out and you have an extended runway, I would try to focus on the GMAT first, and then think about your applications. But I would say probably 95% of the folks that I work with are parallel tracking applications with test prep at the same time. And so I would just make sure that you're carving out enough time to build a reasonable study schedule. And really think about, and just really think about how you can do both, and while not neglecting one or the other. For extracurriculars, if you are more than 3 years removed from school, you should have extracurriculars that are not related, that are not undergrad experiences. I have a lot of folks I work with who have fewer than 3 years of experience, and sometimes in those cases, undergrad experiences might be relevant. But really, this should be things. These should all be activities and things that you work on after you've graduated. All really great questions, folks. All right, I think we've covered everything in the chat. I'll give folks just another minute, but again, it was such a pleasure spending the evening or afternoon or morning with you all. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you all the very best on your applications, and as I mentioned, feel free to reach out if you'd like to schedule some time for a consultation as well. Thank you so much.